The following care guide is brought to you by a true expert with questions asked by me. If you like this care guide, go watch or listen to the full episode on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcast from. If you want to support the channel, please like, comment, subscribe, and share this video with anyone it may help. You can also support me on Patreon. And one last thing before we get to the care guide, if you like this hobby and you want it to stick around for a while, please go get yourself a membership to USARK in USARK, Florida. What do you think about doing a care sheet or a care guide for carpet pythons?
Yeah, we can talk about that.
All right. So look at this sort of from the perspective that this is a keeper that is keeping a pet and as a display animal. So no bins, but I'll, as an adult animal, as a baby, you're probably going to want to keep a carpet python in something smaller and more secure, right?
Yep.
Okay. So in your experience, do they make a good pet, carpet pythons, or are they more of a display animal?
They're both. They're great pets. They're hardy. I think they're forgiving of some husbandry issues. You don't have to be as dialed in maybe with some other species as far as the temperatures they will tolerate. They definitely have their range, but I think that range is maybe a little bit bigger and more forgiving. But at the same time, as a display animal, I mean, they're semi-arboreal. A lot of times you'll see them out and about. They'll perch, they'll climb. They obviously, come in any flavor, pattern, color you could think of. So I think they can give you a lot of both of those as far as being a great pet and a great display animal.
Which one out of all the carpet pythons, which one do you think makes the best pet? Or do you think that they're all about equal?
Once you get to the adult size, they're all fairly similar. I think if anything, it's going to be individual personality. And I don't think there might be some trends when you look at subspecies or species, but once you get to the adult stage, I think they're all fairly similar. Some of them, I think, will be more likely to start out not as defensive as babies. Maybe your Brettles, in my experience, the Papuan carpets, compared to Darwins or jungles or coastals, which in my experience tend to start out more defensive as babies. But yeah, once you get to that adult stage, I think they're all fairly similar as far as temperament.
How about the inlands? How's their personality when they're babies? Are they pretty defensive?
I hear a lot of people talk about how they're much more placid or easy to work with, less willing to strike. Mine seem pretty similar. They defensive as babies, and but once you get them in hand, they're fine.
Right on. Now, is that aggressive, sort of, I guess I don't know how to phrase that, but they have a bad rap, for being pretty aggressive snakes. Do you attribute that just to the juvenile animals and that's something that they grow out of?
For the most part, I think, like we were talking about, I think it's a survival mechanism. When you're that small and likely to be predated upon by a number of different things, like you probably need to have that mechanism built in to give you the best chance to survive. So as long as you take that into understand that, but then once they get bigger with age, with size, they tend to not be like that as their first reaction. Now, that can sometimes be confused with, I think, feeding response. When you go into a cage or a tub to take an animal out, depending on how, what your routine is and what they experience, a lot of times that is associated with feeding, so they may be thinking food first, which may mean strike or what some people may interpret as aggressiveness. It's generally not. Now, some animals, that feeding response can be harder to turn off than others. But generally, once you do that, and you have the animal out, they realize they're not being fed, especially for a larger animal, for the most part, generally speaking, and there are rules to the exceptions to the rule, I should say, they're pretty easy to work with for the most part.
How do you turn off that feed response if you were dealing with a new keeper that's interested in getting a carpet python?
Yeah, what you can do is, just use a hook to, you know, to take them out. If they have that warm hand coming into their cage to grab them, they may associate that with feeding, as if it were a food item, or possibly a predator. So if you take them out with a hook, for example, that doesn't have a heat signature, I think that's a great way to get them out, and then bring them into your hand from the hook.
Right on. Do you recommend Substrate or paper towels, or any form of paper, I should say? Like what would you recommend to a new keeper?
I prefer paper. That's what works best for me. I think it's sanitary. It's easy to notice when there is a mess that needs to be cleaned. It's easy to roll up, get it out, wipe it down, new paper in. Other folks prefer Substrate, and that can work just fine too. For me, I don't know. I don't like Substrate as much. I think it's a little bit of unnecessary risk. Like, I tend to use Cypress when I use Substrate for the colubrids, and if that were to be ingested, most times it'll be passed. But if you were to get a sharp or thicker piece, wedged in the throat, that is a risk that can easily be avoided by using paper. Down here in Florida, you don't have to worry about humidity. A lot of folks will use Substrate to try to help increase humidity, which in my experience, you also don't really need to do for carpets. For me, they did just fine in Colorado with very low humidity, down into the 20, 30%, no problem at all, no problem shedding. So I didn't have a need for it there, and I don't have a need for it here in Florida either. But it's preference, it can work both ways.
How do you feel about the whole bioactive thing?
I don't have any experience with it, so I can't speak to it firsthand at all. I don't think it's going to work for a bigger python as well. I mean, at least you can't rely upon that to do all the work for you. You're still going to have to stock clean. So in my mind, for me personally, when I'm working with a good sized collection, it comes down to efficiency and effectiveness. How can I make sure everybody's got great husbandry and allow me to, not be slacking and to get through everybody in a very timely manner. And for me, that's paper. There's no way I'd be able to do that with bioactive.
Yeah. So if you're just a person keeping, one snake, in this case, a carpet python, you have more time, then maybe it's, it's a whole different ball of wax, right?
Yeah, certainly. If you just have one or a couple, you could definitely do that. But I would guess, again, I don't have any personal experience from it, but I would assume, just from the amount of waste that you'll get from an adult animal, that bioactive is not going to take care of that entire pile of poop. You're going to still have to do some spots.
Yeah, 100%. Do you prefer ambient or gradient keeping?
Gradient, for sure. I'll do a warm end, or a basking site, and then a cool end, so that they can choose, and then nighttime drops year round.
What are your temps? What do you recommend? What's your hot spot and what's your cool end?
So generally speaking, I'll shoot for a warm area about 85 or so. The cool area of the cage will be, during the day, somewhere around 80, maybe upper 70s. And then at night, I don't offer any heat. They just drop down to ambient, which for me, runs about 76 or 77.
That's 85. It's so crazy, because I remember keeping, 10 years ago, before I had gotten out of the hobby. Now I'm back in it, and everything is cooler. It's more individualized. So with 85, do you notice that they really use that basking spot a lot? That they get on it and absorb that, or do they still kind of keep away from it?
Well, that's part of the reason I don't even go above 85, is because they don't even sit on that all day long when it's offered. If they have 12 hours of heat offered to them at only 85, and they don't use all of that, that tells me that it doesn't need to be any higher than that. But carpets, like we were talking about, I think they give you a range you can work within. So if you have a basking area, even as low as, low to mid 80s, or even as high as 90, I think as long as you offer them a gradient, in a way to get away from that heat, I think you'll be just fine.
Yeah. So how do you verify your temperatures?
Temp gun, you can use a temperature gun. The one that I use has a laser on it, so you can point and shoot, and that'll tell you exactly what that surface temperature is. And then, like we were talking about too, observe the animal, and try to read what they're telling you. They're sitting on that heat all the time, or they're never on it, and just try to figure out what they're telling you.
What do you think about temperature cycling for an animal that you don't plan to breed? Do you think that there's benefit to that? That it's a natural part of their existence that should be included, or do you think that just whatever's going on in your environment is enough? Because like we talked about before, if it's wintertime, your house is gonna be cooler, and then
Mm-hmm.
it's gonna be warmer in the summer. Do you think that there's a benefit to leaning into that, even if you're not going to breed?
In my opinion, yes. I think these animals, for the most part, especially the further away from the equator you get, experience seasons. We all experience seasons. So I think as best as you are able to recreate that in captivity for them, I think it's good. The more heat, the higher the heat, and the more often that heat is offered. I think that's part of the problem folks used to have back in the day with diamond pythons and maybe with some other animals, is if you're giving too much heat too often and not an opportunity to get away from it, what you're doing is you're speeding up the metabolic life of that animal, and maybe aging it prematurely. So personally, I think seasonality and temperature drops is a good way to go, regardless of, if you're breeding or not. And they can
Right
certainly
on.
handle it.
Yeah. So when you're doing that sort of temperature cycle, you're also reducing the amount that you feed.
Yep. You need to make sure you take that into account. You don't want to just be dropping temperatures and continue to feed like you could, because, that animal, the way it works, it needs to have that heat to be able to digest the meal and carry out all of its functions. So
Right.
you have to do both. You can't just do one. That might result in problems.
Yeah. So if you're throwing a rat at it and keeping it in the low to mid 70s, that's going to lead to some issues.
Or at least, if you're going to continue to feed while you're dropping temperatures, make sure the animal has the opportunity to warm up during the day. And you might also consider reducing the size of the meal that's being offered, so the animal can, digest it easier if it doesn't have access to as much heat as it would during a warmer season.
Okay. If you do plan to breed, so let's say this individual picked up another animal, like a normal human being, and they plan to breed at some point. When do you think that you should start cycling the temperatures? So maybe if you were keeping the baby in a tub with pretty consistent, belly heat or something like that, when do you think that acclimating them to seasonal changes should start?
I'd say the sooner the better. I can explain the way I do it, and my babies up to until maybe the point where they're a yearling or so, they don't have a drop. So that's the only exception to the way I do things. But once they grow out of that baby shoebox tub size enclosure, at that point, they are experiencing nighttime drops pretty much to the same extent that the adults are. So
And
I'd
you
say,
just totally take
and
away
that's
heat
going to be
at night.
preference.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And then again, I think that's preference. There are some folks who do ambient, and keep their animals, babies, adults, at a steady temperature and don't really, give a warm area or a cool area. They might just keep them in the low 80s, 80, 82, 24/7. And that can work for people. A lot of people, myself included, prefer the gradient strategy. I think if you're going to move from one to the other, I think one thing you just need to make sure you do is do it slowly, and make sure you're watching that animal instead of shocking it. That can cause some problems. But the way I do it, yeah, is, for about the first year or so, they have just 24/7 heat. It's not a lot of heat. It's similar, maybe on the warm end about 85. The cool end will be about 80 or so. And then after about a year, when they move up a tub size, that's when I transition them to nighttime drops. And that's what they'll have for the rest of their lives with me.
And that nighttime drop is just the heat totally turns off at night.
Yep. But again, it's not getting any lower than 76, 77 during the warm seasons, and during the winters for the younger animals that aren't adults that I'm not cycling for breeding, I don't let them fall quite as low as the adults. They'll still get their nighttime drops, but in the winter, it may only be as low as low 70s. They're never going to hit. I never let the young ones or the yearlings, 2-year-olds hit upper 60s.
Is that because you're feeding more often when they're younger?
I do feed the younger ones through the winter, but it's not nearly as much, and they are smaller meals as well. So if I were feeding, maybe a 2-year-old or so every couple of weeks during the winter months when they're having lower nighttime lows, I may only feed it, every 3 or 4 weeks.
Oh, wow. Okay. And that's for 0 to 2 about?
I'd say roughly maybe 1 to 3, somewhere in there. For the yearling stage, the baby stage, I'm feeding them consistently all seasons, every week or two. But once, you kind of out of that baby phase, at least a year old, that's when I back it off. And during the winter months, I back off the feeding even more.
Okay. What do you use to control your temperatures? Are you doing timers, dimmers, thermostats?
I use thermostats. I use herpstats for everything now as far as pythons. I moved over I used to have Ranco thermostats, which are rock solid, fantastic. I never had a problem with them, but they're manual, so those you can't, they're not programmable, like your herpstats and some other options that are out on the market. So for those, if you're going to use something like that, you basically have to use it with the timer if you're going to do night drops. And then you're basically, it's all or nothing, there's heat or there's nothing. So personally, and now I prefer the herpstats. They seem to be great. They offer you a lot of options you can program in. You can do your nighttime drops. You can ramp up and ramp down. So it's not just heat clicking on and then full bore. You can kind of ease into it, like maybe the animals would experience in nature as the sun rises, and then, the other way around in the evening.
Right on. Yeah, it seems like that's everybody's go-to now for thermostats. Yep. So what do you recommend for humidity, to maintain humidity to get a good shed and everything? I know we kind of already covered that previously, but do you think that they benefit from being misted while they're in shed?
For carpets, I've never worried about it, and I've never had problems. That be it Colorado with very low humidity or here in Florida with more. They seem to shed just fine. I'd say the one thing when you do see a shed, well, to answer your question, I wouldn't worry about misting. The one thing I would do though is, after a shed, I would check, maybe the areas that if they're going to have a problem, sometimes you may have a little bit left on the tip of the tail. Or if you have an eye cap or somewhere around the head, just check the animal over and make sure there's none left on there. But generally with carpets, regardless of humidity, you're not going to have usually any problems shedding.
How would you deal with that with a retained shed on the tip of the tail or an eye cap?
You can just manually, little pressure in between your fingers and pull that off the tip of the tail, or, use a fingernail if you need to get a little bit of a start. Eye cap, same way. Carpets are pretty easy to restrain. It's blood pythons or Sumatran short-tail. That's a different story. They're not going to let you pin them down and pull off an eye cap, but you just use a little bit of friction, from your fingers and, maybe your thumb or something and kind of rub it, and that'll usually come off. If not, you can soak it or mist, to bump that humidity. And then if it doesn't peel it off itself, it'll be a lot easier to manually get off with your fingers.
So maybe for a newer keeper, if they notice a retained eye cap or tip of the tail or something like that, you'd recommend give it a soak first just to increase the odds of it coming off easier.
Yep. If you go in there and, there's something left on there and it doesn't come off real easy, with your fingers and a little bit of friction, you can, soak it, mist it, and then it should come off much easier.
Right on. How often do you change water?
Weekly. Yep.
Okay.
So every week they get fresh water, fresh bowl.
Right on. How do you sanitize your bowls?
I use the dishwasher. So I use heat. I don't use disposables like some folks, which can work great. So I have a dishwasher, that I use and run all the bowls through there. It's a lot of loads, but with the heat, that disinfects and seems to do the job just fine. Beats scrubbing them all. Now, if you just have a couple, you can scrub a bowl, no problem, or maybe just throw it in with your people dishes.
Yeah. So do you have like duplicate water bowls? So you throw the new one in, or do you pull them all out, clean them, and then put them all back same day?
I probably don't have quite as many to be able to do, but I do have way more than, one per animal. So I can almost, swap them out while I'm catching up on all the loads to get clean ones.
Nice. What does that take you, about a day?
For the dishwasher?
Yeah, just all those animals. I mean, you said you have how many snakes?
Yeah, it's a good 7 or 8 loads.
Wow.
So it takes multiple days.
Wow.
You need one of those. What I need is one of those, restaurant quality, like 3 or 5 minute dishwashers,
Yeah, for sure. What do you think about offering a bowl large enough for the animal to soak in? Do carpets soak, in your opinion? Do you offer that, or do you just give them something, small enough so they have adequate water to drink?
I think, a good sized bowl that they could soak in is fine. I think I don't ever notice animals soaking, with the one exception being maybe babies. And usually that's something they grow out of fairly quickly. The one other thing I would take into consideration is just making sure the bowl is large enough, because the only thing you might have trouble with is if it's too small of a bowl and easily tipped over, that might result in some cleaning or problems. But generally, in my experience, juveniles, adults don't soak in their water bowls at all.
What do you think makes the babies want to do that?
I don't know. And I've talked to other people about it too, and it's not all of them. In my experience, it's been primarily the poplar carpets and the Darwins that I see that with. I don't see it with jungles, coastals, Brettles, inlands. I've never really seen it with them. It just tends to be, for whatever reason, Papuans and the Darwins.
Right on. How important do you feel a day-night cycle is? So, just sun up, sun down.
Yeah, like we were talking about, that's the way I do things, and I feel it's important, to get that natural cycle. It's only natural, I think, for temperatures to drop when the sun goes down.
Yeah.
And again, like I said, the only thing I do different there is I don't do that with babies up to about yearling age. They just get consistent access to about 85 degrees on the warm end, but they can also cool off, relatively speaking, to about 80, maybe upper 70s on the cool end.
Okay. What about from a lighting perspective? Giving them, do you give them ambient light? Do you give them lighting in their cages? How important do you think that is? Obviously, like, I'm assuming you wouldn't want them to just be in a black void all the time, right?
Yeah. I don't do UV. I've never done artificial lighting. I do have artificial lights in my display cages, simply for my enjoyment, if I want to flip them on at night and check some stuff out, or I'm doing night cleaning or something like that. Mm-hmm. But the light cycle, the photo period that my animals have is all naturals. I've always had a lot of windows in every area and every room that animals are kept in. So they experience the natural photo period, that varies season to season.
Okay. Do you think that's an important trigger too for breeding?
And it certainly can't hurt. I think that, coupled with, lower temperatures, reduced feeding, I think those are some of the triggers that some of those animals need to go. So it's also, I think, easier just to not fight kind of the natural way, depending on your setup. Now, if you're in using a room or an area that doesn't have natural light, then you're going to have to manipulate that depending on what you want to offer. But for me, I've always had plenty of natural light there. I'm not going to try to black it all out and manipulate that. I like to just kind of go with the way things are, where I live, and what the animals would naturally be exposed to. And with carpets, they seem to do fine with it.
I feel like we have a pretty good day-night cycle here in Florida too. Like when my wife and I were out in Colorado 2 years ago, and it was not normal how early the sun comes up. Like also the sun's beaming in your room and it's like 5:30. What's going on here? It's too
Yeah.
early for this.
Yeah. I think the natural light cycles, are good for all of us, animals included.
Yeah. So you don't see any benefit in UVB?
I didn't say that. I've just never used it. So I don't
Okay.
have anything really to speak of. Going off what we've been talking about, it certainly is natural. It's something
Hmm.
that they'll have access to in the wild. I guess they'll, some of mine get it to a lesser extent. If sun is coming in and directly, getting direct light for, maybe a small portion of the day, depending on the angle of the sun, where it's coming in a window and relative to where that cage is in the room or the area. But I've never offered it. So I can't really say.
Okay. So if for the sake of this care guide, if this individual is asking about UVB, would you recommend it or just say, no, it's, do you think
I
that there's
wouldn't.
enough data behind it?
Yeah, and I don't know. I haven't read any studies on it. I'm not aware of any studies out there on it. I would say I wouldn't recommend it because it's nothing that I have any experience with. If I were to start using it, I think what I would do is offer it for part of the day and offer the opportunity for an animal to access it, but also get away from it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So if you're going to have it in your cage, maybe have it, one side, have a hide, multiple hides in there so the animal can get away from it if it doesn't want it.
All right. What's the ideal enclosure size for like an average adult carpet python?
For females, I use a 4 foot long by 2 foot deep by about a 1.5 foot height display cage. Mine are all black and there's a front window. For males, it's for my smaller males or maybe a grow up female, subadult to small adult female. These tubs are great. It's about a 3 foot by 2 foot footprint with only 9 inches of height. I like to offer more height, but if I'm starting in something like this 9 inches of height does give you enough where you can mount perches in there and give them opportunity to get up off the ground. But otherwise, most of my males and smaller females are in a 3 foot by 2 foot. And again, that's about a 1.5 foot of height.
Okay. So if somebody's keeping it just as a display animal, I mean, obviously you could give them a ton of space, but what do you think what would you recommend, for somebody that isn't crazy overboard and, isn't, what do you think the ideal size would be?
I like those for minimums. I
Yeah.
think 3 foot by 2 foot is fine, even for a smaller adult female.
Yeah.
4 foot by 2 foot seems fine for most females. If you get a bigger girl or maybe, like a female bredel, you may need to go to a 6 foot or larger.
Okay.
I don't have like a rule of thumb for every foot of length, excuse me, the animal is, the cage needs to have this much square footage. I don't have anything like that. I don't go by that. And animals are going to be different. Some are going to be fairly sedentary.
Yeah.
Others are going to be much more active. So you need to be ready to tailor that to that specific animal and what it's telling you with its behavior. If it likes to move around a lot and to perch, give it more height, give it a bigger cage. If it's an animal that maybe it's a lazy animal, doesn't like to move as much, is more content sitting around, maybe it doesn't need that much space if it's not going to use it all.
Yeah. Yeah. I've got a boa that I swear she doesn't move for probably 7 days, and then after she passes a stool, then she starts thinking about moving around. But right here, I've got a Timor in that cage. Yeah. He uses every square inch of that space at night.
Mm-hmm.
He's out all over the place. So what do you recommend as the ideal food item for carpets? Rats, mice? Do you ever mess around with any fowl of any kind?
I generally stick to rodents. I'll start my young ones out usually on live mice. And as they get older, it'll be a combination of mice to a certain size, once they outgrow mice, rats, and I work in ASF. Once in a while, we'll do gerbils or hamsters, just depending on, what I have available. But as far as birds, I usually don't offer birds really for much anything, and really none to my carpets.
How do you get them off live mice? How do you make that transition?
I don't usually have too much trouble with it. I like to start with live. It's more simple. It's less work harvesting the animal. I think it elicits that natural feeding response for most of them. And by the time, they're established, and generally I don't have any problem transitioning from a live food item to a warmed, thawed, or a pre-killed item. Carpets have a strong feeding response. I've had very few animals that I've ever had any trouble with. The only trouble you'll sometimes hear about will be, switching an animal over to rats. But even that, I really don't have much trouble with either. That might be, at least in part, a product of overfeeding. But usually, once you get them rolling, most of mine, and in my experience, will take just about whatever you offer them.
How often do you feed in the first year of life?
Every week to 2 weeks, leaning maybe more closer to 2.
Okay. So anywhere between 7 and 14.
Yep.
Right on. And then what about 1 to 2 years old?
For after that baby phase, once you hit a year old or more, I'm generally not feeding any more often than every 2 weeks.
Okay. And then 3 to 5, so on and so forth. Like, when do you really start pushing it out more and more?
For your juveniles, your subadults, what I usually do is, usually every couple of weeks or so. It'll vary. It's not necessarily every 2 weeks. Kind of depends what you have going on in life. But every 2 to 3 weeks or so, and once you hit that adult stage, 3 to 4 years old is usually when I'm doing much more seasonal, where during the feeding season, spring, summer, fall, might be every 2 to 3 weeks versus winter, which might be, depending on the animal, the size, the age, every 2 to 4 or not at all.
Okay. What are some potential health issues that you've experienced with carpets, or maybe you've heard about?
If you're doing a pretty good job, keeping them healthy, keeping the temperatures within the range that they need, fresh water and food, you're not going to have many problems. It's a very hardy animal. All of the animals I've ever kept, I've only ever had 3 respiratory infections. 2 of them, one of them, I believe, was a result of a gravid animal I had with a cleft lip that I used the nest box for, and actually had some moss in there. She got some kind of packed in her lip, and I think that's what caused hers. The other 2 were, I had one other animal get sick, I think because of, it was such a long time ago. And then I had another one get sick right after that, so it might have been related. So I've had 3 total in all of my years. I haven't had one in probably 7 or 8 years. So that really shouldn't be much of a concern. I'd say that the biggest problem that I see is tumors and cancer. Carpets, I don't have nearly as large of a group of any other species, with the exception being blood, Sumatras, and balls. But carpets, of all of those, are really the only species, of those 4 that I've seen tumors and cancer in. So that's something,
What do you
I don't
think's
have a great
causing
answer
that?
for. Yeah, and I don't have a good answer for that. If I knew, it wouldn't be happening. I don't know. I've seen it with older animals. I've seen it. There seems to be somewhat of a correlation. And again, it's a pretty small sample size to speak of from, but with younger males shortly after becoming sexually mature. And yeah, I don't know. So that's one thing, that may happen. But other than that,
Now I'm scared.
no, I mean, it's not that prevalent, but, and the larger your collection is, the more things you're going to see, the more likely it is something like that is going to happen to an animal. But other than those things, I generally haven't really seen any other health problems.
How do you handle the cancer? What's the most humane thing to do when you notice a tumor or growth?
Yeah, I guess that's a bit of a controversial question or answer. I don't know. I guess that depends on, how you see things. You can let it right out, and let the animal live as long as it can, or you could have a surgery, a very most likely expensive surgery that isn't guaranteed to solve the problem long term. It can definitely come back. I know that's happened.
Yeah.
Or you can put the animal down. You got to make the call, based on your opinion, and on that of your vet.
Yeah. Yeah, I
It's case.
guess. Yeah, it feels like letting it ride out is probably the most inhumane thing. And then surgery, like you said, you could have the surgery and then just have it come back, or, you know, it never even got it to begin with.
It's the same with people, you know. Some people prefer to not have treatment. Others would opt for an operation. Some may even go for, you know, for the other option we talked about. It just kind of depends. It's
Yeah.
case by case. There's not a great answer. You know, I think you make your decision based on how you feel about it, you know, and definitely consult a veterinarian, you know, to get
Yeah.
a professional opinion who can maybe assess it a little bit better than just, you know, us as a keeper.
Yeah, for sure. So you said that you generally see that mostly, or you've seen it mostly in males after hitting sexual maturity?
The only two situations I can think of where I see it as an older animal, you know, so maybe 8, 9 years plus. The only younger animals I've ever seen it in, and again, this isn't a large sample size to speak from, has been a younger, so like just sexually mature male, you know, maybe 4 to 6 years, somewhere in there. I've never seen it with a younger female.
All right. And do you think that food cycling, do you think that may help with that, maybe reduce the risk, or is it
I
just a shot in
really,
the dark?
I really don't know. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I've had a couple ideas kicking around, but I mean, it's no different than, you know, what we think could cause cancer in humans, you know,
Yeah.
it's really anyone's guess.
Well, that's all depressing. I regret asking that question.
No, and it's no different than working with any type of life, you know, there are going to be health problems at some point,
Yeah.
you know, and the larger collection you have, the more things you're going to experience and you're going to have to deal with, you know. I don't mean to make it sound like it happens all the time, because it certainly doesn't.
Yeah.
You only have a couple of animals or one. I mean, the likelihood that that would happen is very low, but it goes up when you have many animals.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've got hundreds, right? And I'm sure you've sold hundreds of babies. Do people stay in contact with you? Do they tell you like, hey, this animal got sick or whatever?
Some do. You know, I can't think of I haven't been breeding for that terribly long either. So I mean, the oldest animal that I've produced and sold at this point would only be 10 or 11. Most people, yeah, I may get a picture, an update here and there from people, maybe for the first couple few years, but after that, you know, unless it's someone I'm in contact with, or, you know, have become friends with or something, I don't often hear updates after that. I can't think of an. I do. Well, there was one person in Colorado who let me know there was an animal she bought that ended up having cancer, like we were just talking about. She opted to do an operation to remove it, but then it came back, and they ended up having to put the animal down in the end. But yeah, I don't get nearly as many updates or pictures, or, you know, or follow up contact as I like.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Well, you're going to hear all about the girl that I got from you.
Right on, man. Yeah, I saw that post you put up of her handling her, you know, working on her a little
Oh,
bit.
yeah.
It seemed like
Thinking about biting me. It was hilarious.
it seemed like she didn't even want to, but it was just like, I don't know, he's holding me, so maybe I still should. It was weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was the most bizarre behavior I've ever seen from her, because normally it's either she's biting and very nervous, or she goes, or she's curious and exploring and doesn't care about anything. And for some reason that day, anytime I'd move my hand, she'd just open up full gape and just come over like, I will do this, just like threatening me, but not actually following up. And now
Yeah.
it's ironic, ever since then, she hasn't been biting anymore, and she's still, she does that kind of fake out that they do, where when you touch their body, they like, come
Mm-hmm.
over to you real quick and almost headbutt. But yeah, she's chilled out a lot. She was a firecracker when those first 2 or 3 weeks. I mean, I remember I had her out. I think I was changing her water, and I just took her out, and I walked by, and my wife goes walking by, and she struck at my wife so hard that she flew out of my hand, and luckily my Spider-Man reflexes kicked in, and I caught her mid fall. But yeah, she's awesome.
Seems like
Speaking,
she's coming around and starting to turn the corner for you.
yeah, for sure. Speaking of that with handling, what do you recommend for handling? Do you with babies and everything, do you notice that they get really stressed out by it? How often do you, so if somebody gets a baby from you, let's say it's less than a year old, and how long should they let it settle? And then how often should they handle for that, up to a year old?
Generally, what I like to do, when you get an animal in, is just to let it settle, for a week or so, just kind of leave it be, make sure, it has water, allow it to get used to its new enclosure, to its environment, to the stimuli going on around it. After a week or so, usually what I do and recommend is, at that point, offer it a meal. And then after that, hopefully it takes, and let it sit again, for another few days or a week. And I say at that point, you can start handling. It depends on the animal. One thing for baby carpets, like we were talking about before, they can be defensive. That's their survival mechanism. If you're not okay getting a nip here and there from a little baby carpet python, maybe it's not a great fit, but they're not terrible bites. They're not going to bite and wrap and tear your finger off. You might get some little pin pricks and draw a little bit of blood. But as far as handling, one thing, I guess one little strategy you can use would be a hook. If you want to do that to take them out, that will help them get used to, coming in and out of their enclosure, but not with a hot hand. You can, one other reason I like to use paper, and this is more handy, I think, when it comes to bloods and things like that, is it allows you to kind of slide the animal and scoop it. I think if you act, I forget where I heard this, but I remember hearing somebody say, if you act more like a branch than a hand, it helps the animal feel a little more comfortable. So if you're not grabbing it, and gripping it, maybe just allowing your fingers to act like a branch or a bush and something for it to sit on and grip.
Yeah.
That can help a little bit if it's a real defensive animal likely to strike. But like we were talking about, with age, time, size, generally they're going to grow out of that.
Right on. Do you think that an adult carpet python that somebody maybe wants to rehome or something would be a better option for a newer keeper? Somebody that's less into being bitten?
Maybe, but that could also present some other things you need to consider. An animal that's an adult is very used to where it's been. And if it's been there and kept that way for a long time, you got to consider, the transition, and it can take a lot longer to transition to you versus a baby, which you get, and mostly all it's known is you, and then you can kind of mold it, and it kind of grows up and is familiar with the way you're keeping it and working with it.
It is pretty wild, right? They do seem to get to know you as an individual, like their personalities really, really change. Have you noticed that, where they kind of know you, and or do you think I'm just putting too much of my human thought into the snakes?
No, I mean, you're not overly anthropomorphizing it. I think each animal is unique and individual, and some are even unique and individual depending on the different times of the year. I have some animals who most of the time are just fine to work with, and then other times of the year they are so food crazy. It's hard to turn off that feeding response, because maybe they're trying to build follicles and they just want that food, or maybe it's a male for whatever reason, and that's all he thinks about and all he wants at that time. Every animal is unique, so we're talking in generalities here, and you can't take that as gospel for everything.
Sure.
You just, with time and experience, observe the animals, watch it, learn its habits, and figure out what it's telling you, because the behavior that it has, that those are going to be your only indicators of what that animal needs and how to give it what it needs.
Right on. All right. Well, that's the care guide for carpet pythons. I appreciate that.
I think, a really big thing that I didn't really have is, if you do have the opportunity to find a mentor, especially hands-on in person, take someone up on the opportunity, seek somebody out. And because if you can gain a lot of experience from someone who's done it and have them show you things hands-on, I think that type of experience is very worthwhile. It was something that I wish I would have had. I was lucky to have a couple of people I consider mentors, but it was never in person.